Okay, and Catherine, whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
All right. Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Northeast Aquatic Plant Management Society's 2026 Winter Webinar Series, Session 1. So giving you a little bit of background about our society, our mission is to assist in the management of aquatic vegetation, to, to provide for the scientific and educational advancement of members, to encourage scientific research in all facets of aquatic plant management, to promote an exchange of information among members, and to extend and develop understanding in the discipline. Our members are from academia, government agencies, private consulting firms, herbicide manufacturers, and lake associations. We have annual meetings, annual plant camps, webinar sessions, as well as student scholarships for up to $10,000. I encourage you to check out our website at www.neapms.org to learn more about us. Let's see, got a little, the page is not turning. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. Okay. So today's session is focusing on lake management. The webinar is set to run from 1 to 3. There will be 2 presentations followed by Q&A at the end. Please type your questions into the chat box and the moderator, that's me, will read them during the Q&A session. Please note that we are able to offer CEUs for this webinar. Please register in Teams to receive those credits. The webinar will be recorded and will be shared via link on the NEAPMS website. I'm still having a little bit of a challenge getting these slides to move. Okay, not sure why. Oops, there we go. Okay, so our presentations today, first presentation is Westbrook Pond. That's a damn good case study by Luke Gervais, GEI Consultants. Luke Gervais has been an ecologist and project manager with GEI Consultants Huntington Station office since August 2019. He's a graduate at SUNY ESF with a BS in Aquatics and Fisheries Science and SUNY Oneonta with an MS in Lake Management. He's a certified lake manager through NEAPMS. He's a licensed aquatic pesticide applicator in New York and a jack of all trades. And he has experience working on lakes and ponds throughout the Northeast, surveying invasive species in aquatic and terrestrial world, lecturing to groups, and has a particular passion and interest in aquatic vegetation and fisheries management. He also conducts tree inventories, is a wetland delineator, and participates in a wide range of restoration projects. Luke, welcome, and please take it away. Let me just go ahead and stop sharing my screen. So please go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Kathy. I'm gonna go ahead and turn on my video because my hands move too much and it helps me illustrate things as I speak, which some of you know from meeting me over the years. Let me share my screen here as well. Okay, can everyone see that opening slide there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for inviting me to give this talk today. And I just want to also thank the board of directors and everyone who was involved with the past annual conference. It was really good to be there this year again, and it was certainly run quite well, and it was appreciative of all the good conversations that we had while at the conference. So today I'm going to be talking about Westbrook Pond. I spent way too much time thinking of a good title on how to present this because of how unique of a situation it is, and settled on Westbrook Pond. It's a damn good case study. So with that, let's get into it here. Okay, so just a brief kind of agenda for how I'm going to kind of go through this talk. We'll give a brief introduction to myself. I believe, I've met most of the people that are on the call already, whether it be at an APMS meeting or something else in the industry. But then kind of just go over our target species that we're looking at here on Phragmites, get into the Westbrook case study itself, and then kind of discuss why it matters and what kind of stage we are at in terms of managing, freshwater impounded ponds and dams in the Northeast. And then we'll have time for some Q&A and discussion later on as set up within the webinar. So as Kathy said, my name is Luke Gervasi. I'm a certified lake manager. I went to SUNY ESF to do aquatics and fisheries science and gained an MS in lake management from SUNY Oneonta. Spent time with DEC, a little bit in New Jersey with DEP and as a watershed steward. Then worked as an aquatic biologist with the Pond and Lake Connection. And then spent some time working with LISMA, or the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area, and have been working at GI for about 6.5 years now. If we have never met face-to-face at a APMS conference, I would encourage you to come up and say hello if I don't do it to you as well. Always a great opportunity to talk to the few of us that are in the aquatic plant management world. and I would welcome that opportunity in any future conferences. So before I get started kind of talking about Westbrook itself and why I'm here to talk about it today, I would just like to kind of go over some of the project collaboration that has been involved with this project itself. Between GEI, Seatuck Environmental Association, and New York State Parks. I would also be remiss to not include LISMA in that list. So LISMA, for those who aren't familiar with the New York State PRISM, PRISM, not ON, system in New York State. There's a group of partnerships for regional invasive species management, and LISMA is the Long Island-based PRISM within the state. So the project that I'm going to be talking about today was funded through the 2024 DEC Invasive Species Grant to Seatuck with GEI as a project partner working on it. And the land that we're actually going to be talking about is on New York State Parks property. So the three of us have been kind of working together as a unique group, I would call it, as a for-profit consulting company and a nonprofit group, as well as a state organization. And so kind of the roles that we all provide within the project itself. Seatuck provides volunteers for hand pulling of sporadic populations of random invasives and doing education events, as well as kind of stewarding the property, while GEI, so myself and my colleagues, we do a lot of the invasive species management for dense monocultures of select invasives, which in this case would be frag, as well as mapping efforts and permitting efforts with the state. For those unfamiliar with Seatuck, I would just like to do a little bit of a shout out. They are a wildlife-based conservation organization here on Long Island that do a lot of really cool and interesting work, like the river herring and eel survey, habitat restoration, excuse me, a lot of community science surveys, policy work, land protection, and they've just gotten involved with river otter work, as river otters were extirpated from Long Island for a number of years, but have recently actually showed back up thanks to some of the efforts that the organization does themselves. So good organization to get involved with if any of you are not familiar with who they are and what they do. Okay, so we are going to follow the path of evolution here. We're going to be our little fish that's going to step out onto land now a little bit. I know obviously NEAPMS is a very aquatic plant-focused group. We're going to be talking about one of our emergent plants that I'm sure all of you on the call know Phragmites and know it well. And if you don't, you're lying to me because I know for a fact that you've seen it everywhere in the past. So frag, or common reed, it is a native plant to Europe. It's distributed throughout most of the globe, and on Long Island specifically, and in other areas of the Northeast, it is very, very widespread. It could reach heights of up to 15 feet, and it needs wet soils to thrive. Unless it's in a crack in the pavement and somewhere in the city, then it could still grow there too, because it's just a damn hardy plant. One thing that we've kind of noticed through the years working with it is that there tends to be a difference in freshwater versus tidal habitats with Phragmites, only in its height difference. It could still deal with salt water and more tidal habitat, but it tends to be a little bit shorter in height than when it is in truly freshwater. So just something unique to consider with it when dealing with it as well. The biggest issue with this plant is that it has a durable rhizome. It's its primary means of spread and reproduction, and it is a very deep rhizome that grows about 5 or 6 feet within the sediment, making it a pretty unique plant to manage and making it pretty difficult, as most of you probably know. It has this unique seed tassel or feather duster that's a pretty standalone characteristic and makes the plant easy to identify when looking at other native grasses. Okay, so you all recognize this area. We're looking at, most of the Northeast in New York here. If I didn't say it earlier, I am based on Long Island in GEI's Huntington Station office. And like a typical Long Islander, when I talk about Long Island, I expect all of you to know exactly what I'm speaking about when I'm talking about it, right? So we're going to look at where this site actually is so I could hone in on where we're actually speaking about and the impacts of what I'll be going into with today. So here's a map of Long Island. Our site is Westbrook Pond. That's here on the south shore of Long Island, just by the Great South Bay. Okay. Westbrook is in this general area, just south of the Connecticut River State Park. So you can kind of see that large park that's right there in the middle of the map, and then where it flows down into the Great South Bay. So obviously a pretty significant water body here on Long Island. This is an image of what was once Westbrook Pond. So you can see what we're kind of looking at here. Pretty typical eutrophied pond on Long Island and in the Northeast in general. dealing with a lot of lily growth and excessive coverage, a lot of invasive plants that were also present, submerged aquatic invasive plants that were present on the site here. For those of you familiar with the area at all, this is Route 27 or Sunrise Highway, a pretty busy road and a major corridor on the south shore of Long Island. So this is the site and the area that we're looking at. So just to show it again, we're on the south shore here by the Great South Bay, and just south of the Connecticut River State Park, which is one of the larger natural areas here on Long Island. Okay, so Westbrook Pond, it's located in Great River, New York, again on that south shore there. It was an 11-acre pond that was dammed in 1902 based on the New York State DEC dam inventory. So that red circle there in the south end shows where it was dammed and the spillway that was present. This aerial image is from March of 2019. And one thing I would like to note on this image is the random islands that you kind of see in the water that are here. Just kind of remember that spread of where those islands are located for the time being when it is actually dammed up and full of water. So in 2019, I was called out by someone who worked at New York State Parks who ID a couple of aquatic plants because they told me that something happened with the dam and you should come out and take a look at what is going on out here. Pretty familiar foes that were present when I came to look at the plants that were there. So we had some kabamba and variable leaf milfoil that were growing in this area. But what was very unique about it was the fact that the 11-acre pond was no more. So the dam broke and the spillway broke, and immediately this pond went from being a pond into kind of the wet meadow that you see over there in that image to the right. So this image here is in June of 2019. Pretty close to after when the dam broke. I believe it was in early June of that year when the dam broke. And following that dam failure, since then, there have been 7 state-listed rare, threatened, endangered species observed within this wetland habitat after being surveyed by folks with the New York Natural Heritage Program, CTUC, New York State Parks, and other groups. So we're talking about a water body that was dammed up for decades, where all of a sudden these things are popping up out of the seed bank, or they had these islands that were, they're already established on, and now they have more habitat to grow in. So again, we're talking about going from a dammed up pond that was chock full of fanwort, variable leaf milfoil, to a running brook. And since this has happened, one thing that we've noticed, and I'll get into it in some couple more slides, is that we've seen more and more trees establishing. So a clear path of ecological succession over time since this dam has broken and failed. Just to give an idea, this is later that year, so this is in September. We're talking about 3 months later, just the progression you could see in this image alone, how much more vegetation has come in and filled in this area, and the brook that is now, going from kind of a wide wetland area to a more narrow brook with a little bit more of a defined bed and bank, and that emergent wetland habitat in the immediate area of where the brook is running. Again, demonstrating this is what it looked like in October of 2025. Another aerial image here. You could still see those islands that persisted throughout time and had trees that were already growing on them. Even when it was actually ponded and dammed up, those islands had trees and other upland species on them. So it's kind of unique to see how they've persisted through time. And just again, to show how much vegetation has filled in this area within the past 6 years now, which sounds crazy to say. Another comparison again, just showing, we went from this pond to a brook within about a week. So very quickly, this spillway broke, and we're looking at a completely new habitat. So in 2021, we were actually called out to come take a look and start doing some Phragmites management on the site, because one thing we know about frag is that it is everywhere here on Long Island, especially in the Northeast too. And there was already a band of Phragmites that was on the site prior to the dam breaking. So as stated earlier, our relationship with CTUC and how this project kind of worked was that we were focusing on more of the monoculture stuff while they were doing hand pulling, which is very difficult to do, as I mentioned, with the rhizome that grows about 5 to 6 feet deep. They're going to do hand pulling with volunteers and their own staff members to remove the Phragmites that is surrounding desirable native vegetation and some of these rare species, because we don't really necessarily want to go near them with any of the herbicide when we know that we have these monocultures on the outside of the pond here. So what we're looking at in this image is the yellow hatched polygons there were basically bands of monoculture Phragmites that even after the dam failure pretty quickly, you know, one thing we know about invasives is that in disturbed habitat, they can very well easily thrive, right? So this area was clearly disturbed. It's prime for invasive species introduction, and Phragmites was already present. So we wanted to say, we have to manage this frag that's here because we know this is a very unique situation and we don't want this to just turn into another Phragmites wetland that's a monoculture of this one plant. So we were again responsible for looking at the monocultures here on the side and the bands that exist over here. This map was completed in 2022, but the survey results are from 2021. This one here is what it looks like in 2024. So one of the, I think, drawbacks of using polygon maps sometimes is that it looks like it's a lot busier and maybe a lot more dense than what it was in the past, when that might not necessarily be the case either. So we went from what was a monoculture area in that yellow hatched area that was 100% coverage to a pretty decent reduction in a lot of those areas going down to about 30 to 39%. And then, a couple areas in the middle closer to the brook that were, under 20 stems, under 10 stems of Phragmites in those more sensitive areas. I don't know if you could see my mouse or not, but, in the kind of the middle of those areas in the wetland habitat there, which again, this is a more intensive mapping effort than that first time around. So we were looking for more because we had just, more funding availability to go and do it and look at what was going on. And actually map what was going on in this area. So, we have a better idea of where these monocultures exist to be targeted with more intense management, whereas CTUC and the other volunteers in New York State Parks could go in and remove those, smaller populations with less dense areas and something that's actually feasible for them to do. Same idea here. This is in 2025. So one of, I think, the most encouraging things is if you look kind of here on the east end, this band that used to be that yellow hatch polygon that was 100%, we're looking at under about 19% coverage in these areas, down to even 5% in this band. There's still, of course, dense areas down here on the south. That's about 50% coverage of Phragmites. And, it's probably expanding a little bit here on the southwestern end, but it's still in very low densities, which for sites like this, quite frankly, that are disturbed and has Phragmites, that invade in the area, they're usually looking at a 100% and not going down to these lower percentages and being managed in a proper way. So just to give some before and after shots, this is on a trail. This is actually part of a pretty large trail system here. If you look just south of Sunrise Highway, there's a trail that goes along the eastern side of this area into the park here. This is right under the culvert by Sunrise Highway, walking through that. So you could see how dense this Phragmites is and how tall it is in this area. It's almost choking out the entire trail. To no surprise to most of you here, herbicide applications worked when, targeting the Phragmites. But what I think is interesting here when looking at this, because we're looking at a site that has so much unique ecological succession going on over time, when the Phragmites was controlled, we saw a lot of American burnweed, or this plant with the white flowers here, kind of coming into the area and colonizing this at first. So because we've been able to be on the site for over 6 years now, we've noticed what are the first plants to come in, where are trees growing, what other plants are coming in, and burnweed seemed to be one of the ones that came up at first in these frag managed sites. Just to give an idea of what the brook looks like now, of course, you can still see some Phragmites kind of here on the shoreline and close in these areas. So again, this would be something, in working with CTUC, where the volunteers would come in and try to remove some of the plants in this area. But we're looking at, this was ponded no less than 4 years ago at the time when this photo was taken. So to just look at what it looks like now, to see that this brook is running again, and we have a pretty significant bed and bank in that area. If you've ever walked through wetlands, you know how enjoyable it could be to walk on some of these hummocks like this. I may or may not have fallen into my waist a number of times, especially on this bank right here. You would think I would know where to step after all this time, but it's always full of surprises. So again, another area here looking at the monoculture of Phragmites. This would be on the northeastern band, the monoculture that was there at first. You could see how dense it is just in this photo alone. and what it looks like a couple years after that now too, with a lot of the dead stems and other plants that are starting to come up and recolonize this area, which is what we want to see. We want to see that native recruitment of other plants coming back in. To give an idea of what else is growing there on site now, again, I just think this is kind of incredible to see when we go from a totally ponded area to within a mere matter of under a decade, we have all these other pollinator plants and desirable native species that are growing and pollinators that are coming back into the area. So I think there's always a unique debate to be had of what ecosystem is more valuable. We have this 11-acre ponded area, which of course with this, society we deal with a lot. We're always talking about ponds and lakes, but if it's chalked out full of invasive aquatic plants and, we have this dam spillway break, and now looking at what we have in this system, it's full of pollinators and native plants and things that are offering a very unique habitat, especially to where it is on the south shore of Long Island. Very pretty photos too, if I could say so, with all the different pollinator flowers. I threw this one in because I think it's kind of funny. The newfar still persists no matter what you do. So even if it's dried up, the soil is wet enough where it is still growing in this kind of wet soil. There's some standing water in the background of that photo. But this was taken in 2025, so there hasn't been, ponded water in here, but the still growing on that wet sediment, which I thought was kind of incredible to see. This is a photo of a red maple sapling. So one of the things when we're talking about Phragmites too, if I go back a couple slides just to kind of show what it is I'm talking about here, you can see that the Phragmites is not going into the forested area. So one of the things with this plant that makes it unique for management is that it does not tolerate shade very well. It really likes full sun or partial sun. So the importance of trees now coming back into the actual wetland habitat and growing in this area is pretty paramount, because what it means is that as these trees grow, we're going to have more and more shade, and it's going to make conditions less favorable for Phragmites throughout time, but more favorable for some of the natives that are naturally recruiting there, or some of the ones that might be restored via restoration efforts. So seeing the little red maple sapling is giving a lot of hope, and there are a lot more of them that are growing back in the area. I think this is a pretty unique photo. One, because of course there's mugwort, so another terrestrial invasive plant growing in the site here. But we also have a white oak sapling growing here too. Again, naturally recruited. Acorn, probably fell there. There's of course that forested area surrounding what was the pond. But to see an oak tree growing here, again, it's incredibly positive to see that there's natural recruitment going on, and will make conditions less and less favorable for Phragmites over time. What is unique about this photo is that you can see the old shells of Asian clam that were present within the pond. This is a totally dried up area. If you had no idea that a pond existed here only a couple of years ago, you would probably be like, what is going on? That we see all these different clam shells. And I kind of always joke that an archaeologist in a couple hundred years is going to have a good time looking at this site and looking at some old fossils. Besides all the cool plants and the pollinators that are coming back, there is more wildlife that is coming back into the site. So this is a photo of a snake taking on a young pitch pine. That is another tree that is also growing on the site here. Now, a pitch pine is not an aquatic plant, of course, but I figured I would show this photo just to demonstrate, kind of some of the succession and what is occurring throughout time as the site goes through this, unique event. All right, so let's kind of get into why Westbrook matters and why this is such a unique situation, specifically on Long Island, and I think a lot of other areas here in New England. We are only going to see more and more dam failures based on their construction dates. A lot of dams were made in the early 1900s and are not maintained properly or maintained at all, and they're just reaching the end of their shelf life. So no matter what we do, we're going to see more and more of these occurring with a lot of the flash rains we're having, more intense storm events, going from drought to flood, and, just all the crazy weather events that we've been having. This site also matters because, again, we get an idea of, okay, I think I said it during the poster slam at this press conference, let's let our intrusive thoughts win and see what happens when a dam breaks and we let it go back to a wetland. What would this actually look like? So we kind of have this unique, lab experiment in a natural setting where we get to actually watch the succession that occurs. The dam failures, it's not me speculating. On Long Island specifically, within the last couple of years, there have been a number of other dam failures within the area. So if you are familiar with Blydenburg Park in the middle of the island, there was a 100-acre pond on site that in June of 2024, the dam that was located there, which is about 15 feet in height, failed and the entire pond drained right after that. Now, I'm not going to comment on any personal opinions or thoughts on this because it is a very highly political thing right now on Long Island. There's a lot of different opinions, but I just wanted to present it again as another case study and a reason to say, okay, here's another example of a dam failing in the area in New England. And I would like you all to kind of also think too on your regular commutes or when you're driving, 4 hours to go to a field site, how many dams or spillways do you drive by where you think, I want you to think to yourself next time, what would happen if that thing just broke randomly? And we had no preparation, no sort of plan of what to do, or there was no proper maintenance of it to prevent it from happening in the first place. So looking at this, the yellow circle here again is where that dam and spillway is located. And you can see that we go from 100-acre pond to that, river and floodplain now. And this is what it looks like just a year later with more vegetation coming in. I think what's interesting with this pond in particular is that it was loaded with hydrilla before the dam broke out, and there is still hydrilla that is further upstream. So it just so happens that between this and Westbrook Pond, there are multiple aquatic invasive species that are in that water body that, of course, if they're going to be rebuilt, there's still matter in the seed bank that would allow those plants to just come right back. So it's interesting to kind of think about that in terms of lake management of, if it is rebuilt, we're going to probably have to manage for these species in the future rather than, if it were left open, we're going to have to manage for other invasive species, but maybe not hydrilla specifically. To give an idea of where Stump Pond in Blydenburg Park is located, so if you look in the middle of the picture here, you can kind of see that, now drained out floodplain. It's a part of the Nissaquag River watershed, which is one of the main estuaries and riverine systems on Long Island that actually flows north into the Long Island Sound. And what's kind of unique about this is obviously 100 acres, 100-acre pond is a lot of water. So when that dam broke, there was actually relatively minimal flood damage just because a lot of it downstream for where it was flooded is parkland and natural areas. So we're really lucky in that regard that there wasn't, any sort of catastrophic events that occurred with all that water coming out when the dam broke. As I said, because of the nature of this and it's a Suffolk County property, it has been a very highly debated thing that has been going on, local to Long Island. But I think there's a lot of lessons for us to take, again, in the Northeast and in New England in general, because there are a lot of dams and spillways that are going to reach the end of their functional life, and having some sort of a plan or an idea of what to do is really important for when something like this occurs. You can actually see in this photo here, it was very appropriately named Stump Pond. But having a plan for what might occur, or having a plan to just actually mitigate some of the dams that are in our local habitats, that we could plan for and have these things set up. So you can see here, there's a CBS fisherman website, News 12, which is Long Island local news, Suffolk County Parks, and it even made it to NPR too. So Stump Pond itself is getting national attention. During that same storm, there was another dam that broke. So again, in June 2024, this is a pond called Mill Pond in Stony Brook on Long Island, where you could see the dam was located here on the north side of the pond, and just you could see how it's draining out. And again, a year later, you have wetland vegetation coming back and growing in and persisting within this habitat. This one, it was not as fortunate as Stump Pond at Blydenburg Park, because where the dam was actually right under a major transportation road, within the area here, and that road got completely washed out. Again, I would say think about this on your commutes or your local communities when you're driving. I'm sure you were all driving across roads where we have dams, spillways that may have not been maintained for over 50 years now at this point, that, if there's a rain event where this happens, it would be a major catastrophic event. Okay, so with that, I just kind of want to get into some takeaways and things to consider. Thank you for listening to an emergent talk and not necessarily something that's a true submerged aquatic plant conversation. But these dam failures and spillway failures, weird failures, all of the above, it's going to be more and more frequent as, again, these dams are just reaching the end of their functional life. A lot of them were built in the early 1900s for, whether it was ice farming, as a mill, someone to just create a pond to have somewhere to fish. They're all very, very old structures that have to be maintained properly and repaired if necessary, which is a pretty lengthy process to get done. But, it's better to have a plan for something than nothing at all, and then kind of just let the dam fail and then not really necessarily know what to do. Going on that as well, it's a good idea to have a conversation maybe about what happens if this were to occur. And now with Westbrook as a case study, we kind of understand what the progression of a site like this might be. We might see rare, threatened, and endangered species coming back up on a site. There's things in the seed bank that persist. We might have a even worse problem with Phragmites or Japanese knotweed or other, invasive species coming in. But is that better or worse than a system with Kabamba or fanwort or Eurasian water milfoil or, whatever it might be? So it's just a kind of pros and cons list of what invasive do you want to battle or what kind of habitat is more valuable for the area we're talking about. But also say not all of these cases are the same. Very generally grouping dam failures and these habitats together, but something like Westbrook, where it has a large bay to essentially flow out into, is not the same as that mill pond that I just brought up in Stony Brook. Same thing with Stump Pond at Blydenburg Park, where that water is now flowing into parkland when that happens. Westbrook was also mainly just used as a trail. There was a lot of fishing that was going on there too, but that doesn't mean something like Stump Pond where there's a lot of fishing. There is also a historical society there. There is value to that pond actually existing and being there on site. So there's just different things to consider when we're looking at potential dam failures and what should be the fate of these systems should that dam fail. And then I think always, when it comes to Phragmites, there's a question of to manage or not to manage. We're not winning the battle against Frag. It's very widespread, it's dense, it's a very good plant at what it does. It's a very strong invader. However, at a site like Westbrook, where we have this very unique situation with rare, threatened, endangered species that are growing in the area and other valuable natives, it was deemed that it is worth managing because we're at a point where the Phragmites was in low density. It would be possible to manage it. We have a group of project partners that are invested in managing the plant at the site and invested in the site for the long term. But that might not necessarily be the case for other areas. Phragmites can be monoculture already. So it's always just an interesting, to me at least, debate to say, is it worth managing this plant that we know is widespread and in the area is not necessarily a priority species because of how widespread it is. But for this microsite, when we're looking at Westbrook, it was certainly worth managing and will continue to be so. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and pass it back over to Kathy. I think we're going to do questions kind of here at the end. So if you have any for me, Kathy, I don't know if you want me to field some now or we could wait until after Paul's presentation.
Let's wait till the end. And I'm just going to remind
Sure.
folks that question number 2 for CEO credits is now, the link is now in the chat box. So next up, if you could stop sharing your screen, thank you. Next up, we have Paul Conti from Alligator talking about vegetated buffer and shoreline management. So Paul is the aquatic segment manager for Alligator. In his role, he supports team members and acts as a resource for distributors and applicators across the country, ensuring they can acquire the herbicides and algicides needed for aquatic plant management and advising them on using them safely and effectively. Paul is involved in new product development where he works on a team to bring new tools for aquatic plant management to the market. Prior to this role, Paul worked as the Northeast Territory representative for Alligator and also worked in the private application sector managing ponds, lakes, and wetlands in New York and New England. Paul has received his BS in biology from Mount St. Mary's University and an MS in environmental science from Drexel University. While at Drexel, Paul's studies focused on aquatic ecology and diatom composition in streams and rivers in eastern Pennsylvania. Paul is an avid fisherman who enjoys angling in saltwater, freshwater, and through the ice. He also enjoys surfing, skiing, attending concerts, and spending time with his family and friends. So we can see your screen. There you go. Okay, thanks, Paul. Please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy. We'll kind of continue on the same group of topics here. We're not talking about true pond and lake, but I'll be talking about vegetated buffer and shoreline weed control. So throughout this, we'll define what vegetated buffers are and shoreline weeds. We'll talk about some of these common weeds that are issues and maybe need to be controlled. We'll talk about the pros and cons of these plants on a vegetated buffer on a shoreline. Talk about the importance of having some of them there and maybe some of the issues that can be associated with some of those common weeds. Then we'll talk about some of the application methods used to control those plants. We'll go into an array of herbicides that are used to do that. We'll go into some detail on it, and we'll talk about a little bit of safety at the end. So of course, generally in a pond and lake setting, weeds are defined as either submerged, growing underneath the surface, floating, growing on the surface of the pond, or floating on the surface of the pond, and emergent, which will be rooted in a pond but emerge up out of the pond. And then shoreline plants could really be anything on the shoreline. Many of those emergent plants can be found on shorelines as well. So we will be talking about emergent plants a little bit, but the main focus will be on shoreline and stuff that may not actually be in the pond, but around the pond. So some common shoreline or emergent plants, of course, cattails, Phragmites australis, purple loosestrife, Japanese knotweed, yellow flag iris, reed canary grass are a handful of the most common ones that are managed, whether emergently or on the shoreline of a pond, as well as some more terrestrial type plants that you may find on the shoreline of a pond. In the world of grasses, there are many grasses that you will find around a pond. Willows are a tree species that tend to like to grow near ponds. Autumn olive is a troublesome invasive multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, poison ivy, as well as some of the invasive locusts, tree of heaven, and things of that. So we'll touch on those throughout this. I guess another way to look at shoreline plants too is the vegetated or riparian buffers. These are very important habitats to have around a pond. Really, the really importance of it is they prevent eutrophication. So having a vegetated buffer, riparian buffer around the pond, you have some plants around the pond, and they are going to slow and filter runoff as it flows into the pond. It's very important to really slow down that runoff so there is not erosion issues. If there are plants there or there are plants not there, after a hard rain, all that water will quickly rush into the pond, bring sediment with it, many of nutrients with it. You get some erosion issues with that. You get the filling into the pond with that extra sediment. And we all know the issues of eutrophication with algae blooms and other submerged and floating plant blooms as well. So it's very important to have some plants there to help slow down that, and actually take the time to kind of filter up some of those nutrients as well before they make it into our waterways. They're also very important for shading. By having a little bit of shade around pond, that can help keep the water temperature down. Low water temperature is better for dissolved oxygen. Colder water naturally holds a little bit more dissolved oxygen than warm water does, which is important for fish and other wildlife living in ponds and lakes. And it's also very important, just for habitat around a pond. There's a lot of habitat in these buffers that's great for birds, turtles, and other wildlife that may utilize the pond and the pond's edge for life, food, and shelter. Some issues that can happen with vegetated buffers and some shoreline vegetation is habitat progression. As things progress over time, especially in these grassy areas, there's a lot of room for invasive plants and some invasive trees. Trees like multiflora rose and autumn olive seem to have a real propensity to kind of grow in these areas. There's a lot of issues with those invasives there. They're very aggressive. They create these monocultures, and a lot of the wildlife that we have there is not adapted to survive or live with those plants there. So it's important to control those and make sure we have a nice diverse native habitat rather than these invasive monocultures. There also can be an issue with fallen trees. Fallen trees can be great fish habitat. Bass and other fish like that do like to hang around the trees. It provides some shelter or places of ambush for them as well. But when you do have a fallen tree around a pond or lake, there can be some bank destabilization and erosion issues there. If a tree falls in and tears up the bank with it, you have some bare soil there, and after rain, it's going to keep washing away the bank, bringing in more sediment, bringing in some nutrients with that as well, which can cause issues. And then, kind of looking more like a pond owner side, there is an aesthetic value to vegetation around a pond. Folks do like to look at their pond. They don't want to have their visuals blocked. And many folks, they don't necessarily like the messy aesthetic that can come with a vegetated buffer. So it's very important, though, to educate these people the importance of a buffer why we need the buffer, why we need these plants around a pond. But I think as managers, we can maybe manage it in a way that still has ecological value, but may make these pond owners happy as well. And of course, recreation, having a vegetative buffer there, of course, can sometimes limit your access. But I think from this photo here too, there's nice ways to kind of find a nice medium there. You can put some trails through your buffer so people can still walk around the pond and access the pond there as well. But for the reasons mentioned, it is very, very important to have vegetative buffer and plants on your shoreline and growing around your ponds and lakes. So these shoreline habitats, they are not, true aquatics habitats, but they are, around a pond. So it is important to use aquatic approved herbicides when working on these areas. We want to make sure, we are continuing to protect our water resources. And really, there's a lot of concerns with, overspray. If you accidentally overspray a plant and it goes into the pond, issues with drift when applicating on a windy day, and some runoff as well. Product gets down in the soil and can run into ponds. So if you are working, even if it is a terrestrial environment, around a waterway, it's best to use aquatic approved herbicides so we know that our applications will not harm the wildlife and the ecosystem that we're working around. So now we'll kind of go into the application, what we can do to manage some of these plants and some of the common application methods. Really, the main ones are foliar, basal bark, cut stump, and hack and squirt. So a foliar application, that's probably the most common application that most aquatic applicators, really any applicator, are familiar with. In the aquatic environment, using them on floating plants and your emerging plants. Then on your shoreline, you'll use them on small brush, shrubs, grasses, and herbaceous plants. Simply a foliar treatment is you're going to use a diluted application method. You put the herbicide in a backpack or a tank. It's usually diluted pretty severely, really using like 1 to 2, maybe 3% solutions, if that. You want to spray it onto the leaves of the plant with that herbicide mixture there. It is very, very important to spray the crown of the plant, the very, very top of the plant, because if you are spraying the crown of the plant, then the herbicides will be translocated all the way down into the roots of your target plants. If you do not spray the crown of the plant, we call it side trimming sometimes. You may damage part of the plant, control maybe half of the plant or parts of the plant, but you will not get that total control that you're looking for when controlling your target weed. So again, very, very important to spray the crown of the plant. But an issue with spraying the crown of the plant is it's best usually not to do it anything taller than you are, taller than the applicator. Many application companies too will have policy, and even some state legislation has policy preventing the foliar spray of plants greater than 6 feet in height. Really, the issue with that is if you are doing a foliar treatment, you're spraying 6 feet in height, you're spraying that up in the air. When herbicide is going up in the air, there is some increased risk for drift. The higher it up there, the longer it is in the air, the more chance there is for a wind to grab that and move it off site there. So it's best to do for smaller brush and vegetation, these foliar treatments. Another issue kind of with that too, it can be a little bit difficult to be selective with your applications, especially if it is a windy day. So as an applicator, you have that responsibility to really pick and choose when you apply. It's best not to do this again on windy days to make sure that your application or your herbicide is staying where you want it to be. Another technique, kind of a foliar technique, is wiping. Wiping is quite tedious, but if you are in some sensitive areas with a lot of maybe rare or endangered important native habitat, rather than spraying the herbicide on the plants, you can wipe them on there with a wicking stem, which is a nice method as well. And it's very, very important to keep in mind the timing of when doing foliar treatments. We'll go into this a little bit more detail when we talk about specific herbicides. But it's important to know the herbicides and really the life cycle of the plant. That will help you make a decision on when to do your foliar treatments. But most of the time, a couple herbicides you will do in the spring, but most of the time these foliar treatments are typically done in late summer or fall when plants are getting ready to overwinter and they're bringing a lot of that energy down into the roots rather than into the growth of new leaves and so forth. So I mentioned too, foliar treatments are not great for really trees over 6 feet in tall, 6 feet in height, because it is difficult to reach the crown with your spray. You're having more risk for herbicide drift there. So a really great technique when you cannot spray these tall plants is a basal bark treatment. And in some senses, you are going to dilute the herbicide, but it is a more concentrated herbicide dilution because you need to penetrate the bark there. So really tall trees, brush, woody species that are greater than 6 feet in height and are less than 6 inches in diameter are great applicants for a basal bark application. Great thing about this is you can do it any time in the year. If you are able to identify trees in the wintertime, you could do a basal bark treatment in the winter. which is great for some of those applicators. It extends their season a little bit. You can still be effective whether it's a wintertime application or a summer application. But yeah, you simply just spray the bottom 12 inches of the bark with an herbicide dilution. And it's important to look at the label depending on the herbicide. Some herbicides can be diluted with water, and other herbicides like trichopyr like to be diluted with a oil when doing these basal bark treatments. And really just these oils, like a seed oil or a basal bark oil, they help penetrate the bark better than water does. So that's the importance of that. And another method similar to basal bark, if you have trees or any brush that's greater than 6 inches in diameter, 6 inches in diameter again is kind of the limit for a basal bark application success. So for these large trees, you do a cut stump treatment. You cut down the tree, and you want to immediately, as soon as you cut it down, spray that outer layer of the tree stump with an herbicide dilution. Typically the same concentrations you use for cut stump or for basal bark as you do for cut stump. So it is easy if you're doing an application. Your small stuff, you go out there, spray it with your solution, and your large stuff, you cut it, spray it with that same solution as well. The one issue with cut stump treatments is in the springtime, there's a lot of sap flow. So if you do a cut stump in the spring, oftentimes that sap flow will push the herbicide out of the plant. So you could really only do this in the summertime, fall, or winter. But again, like basal bark, if you can identify trees by their bark in the winter, you can do those applications then. But that is that. But yeah, the really, really important thing to remember with these is to do that herbicide application as quickly as possible. If you come back the next day, that stump starts to seal up and that herbicide does not penetrate as well as it does after a fresh cut. And then another kind of other method instead of a cut stump is a hack and squirt. If you do not have the means to have a chainsaw or the time to go and chainsaw a tree, you can do the hack and squirt method. Rather than cut down the entire tree, you just hack into that cambium layer of the tree, hack all the way around it, and you will spray the herbicide into there, that cambium layer. Just like the basal bark or the cut stump, the same herbicide application or dilution rates. And again, it's very, very important to do this immediately after you make the cuts, where the plant is most susceptible into bringing in the herbicide. But like the cut stump, you cannot do these in the spring just due to sap flow, but great option for summer, fall, and winter applications. So we talked about those methods. Now we'll talk about some of the herbicides that we can use for these different methods to control our shoreline and buffer plants. First one, and probably the most common one, is glyphosate. There are several different concentrations of glyphosate. You'll see a 5-pound or 4-pound glyphosates out there. Always look at the label. 4-pound glyphosates are not registered for aquatics. Most 5-pound glyphosates are registered for aquatics. So always good to check that there. And glyphosate is very diverse herbicide where you can do it for foliar treatments, and you also can use it for your cut stump, basal bark, and hack and squirt treatments as well. And again, it is important with products like this, if you are doing a foliar treatment, to use a proper adjuvant. And adjuvants are necessary to help kind of these herbicides stick to the leaves, be taken in by the plants, be successful that way. Although I know glyphosate does not necessarily, some folks don't like you using glyphosate. So if you are looking for a substitute to glyphosate in the aquatics world, IMOX is usually my first choice. In an aquatics environment, pretty much everything that glyphosate will do, IMOX will do as well. Although you cannot use IMOX for a cut stump or a basal bark, it's a fantastic choice for foliar treatments. And it works really great on all of your grasses, cattails, and other herbaceous shoreline weeds. It does at lower rates. There are some selectivity with it. If you have some invasive grasses like canary grass, you can spray that at a low rate and be selective to some of the natives around there. But it's important to kind of consult the label or representatives like myself to kind of help you dial in some of those rates on where you can be selective with it or not. It also has plant growth regulation properties to it as well. So if you apply this at a low concentration, it's not enough to actually control plants, but you can control and stunt the buffer as well. That's another decent management tool, especially kind of like the HOA areas where they depend on the aesthetic of their vegetation buffers quite a bit. You do a low dose application of IMOX early in the year. It will stunt the growth of those plants, so you don't have to go back and mow them or keep them lower there to keep those folks happy. Really, another difference of this though, in glyphosate, there is a little bit of soil residual, which you have to be careful of. Typically, there's really no risk to trees or anything like that. But if there are some other native vegetation nearby, be careful where you apply it. Don't get sloppy with your applications. If you do over apply it, it will stick around the soil a little bit and can be taken up by the roots of other plants there as well. EPA does label this one as a reduced risk pesticide, which is an agriculture designation. but it's when looking at this herbicide compared to other herbicides, it has a lower toxicity profile compared to other stuff out there, which is nice. And depending on the rates that you can use this in drinking water and irrigation areas as well. And then Imox's cousin, or Imazamox's cousin, is Imazapyr. You will see Imazapyr come in 2 different concentrations. There's a 2-pound formulation and a 4-pound formulation. Both of these formulations do have aquatic labeling. And really the only difference is the 4-pound is twice as concentrated. So if you are switching between Imazapyrs, make sure that you look at the label and are aware of the treatment rates you're going to use. If you've been using a 2 all the time and you use a 4, cut those rates in half, because you'll be putting out more herbicide than you need or should be on those 4-pound products. So very, very important to keep in mind. But similar to Imazamox, Imazapyr is a broad spectrum systemic herbicide. But the big difference between Imazamox and Imazapyr is Imazapyr has much longer soil residual, and Imazapyr is effective on trees and brush. Imox is a little more gentle, better for your grasses and your herbaceous broadleaves. But if you ever are trying to control brush, trees, and woody vegetation, Imazapyr would be the choice there. So you can use it foliarly. You also can use it for cut stump and basal barks. Cut stump and basal barks are a really good application method for this because you can be a little bit more selective there. It's a little less, you're just putting the herbicide where you want it. You don't have to worry about it moving off site, traveling around the soil and causing any off-site damage. But I always tell folks, Imazapyr is a great and powerful tool, but you do have to be very, very careful with it due to its long soil residual and its affinity to kind of move around the soil. If you are a little sloppy with your applications or putting this in the wrong stuff, hardwood trees in particular are very, very susceptible to this product. So be careful when applying it, especially if you have oaks and maples nearby that you want to preserve. Don't get this in the root crown area of it because they can pick it up through the soil. But really, really great for some of your cut stumps and basal barks where you have some really tedious trees, kind of like tree of heaven, for instance, where you cut it and it seems to sprout back from its stumps. This could be a really good product to do a cut stump or a basal bark treatment with. Flumioxazin, this generally is not used too much on the shoreline stuff. It's really just a broad spectrum contact herbicide, so it burns down what it comes into contact with. And it does not control any trees or brush, but it is a good product if you're looking to move away from glyphosate and you want to use a product like Imox. This mixes really, really well with Imox. Flumioxazin gives you that, that quick burn down that glyphosate has. And then with the Imazamox, you're going to get that long-term systemic control that glyphosate has as well. So the combination of those 2 active ingredients has kind of been my go-to recommendation for glyphosate replacements, in aquatic environments, and as well as these shoreline and buffer areas as well. Next is 2,4-D amine. This is a really, really great product for managing buffers. 2,4-D is safe on grasses. So you can spray this in an area. You're going to control broadleaf weeds, but you will not control any of the grasses there as well. So it's great in those vegetative buffer areas. If you have a lot of invasive or unwanted broadleaves, you could confidently broadcast this through your buffer, preserve your grasses, and control those unwanted broadleaf weeds. There's no soil residual from this, which is great. And it does not have little to no effect on any brush, woody species or trees. So more so for your herbaceous broadleaf weeds, this is a great product to apply. Unlike all the other herbicides we mentioned so far, 2,4-D is a synthetic auxin group 4 herbicides, and these herbicides work best when used early in the year. So I recommend applying this in the spring or summer. If you do this in the late summer or fall, like you would have, a glyphosate or a Imazapyr treatment, when plants start to bring the energy and the nutrients into the leaves, you're not going to get great control with 2,4-D. So again, you want to use that early in the year when the plants are actively growing for your best results. And kind of 2,4-D's cousin, same herbicide group. Again, you want to use this one early in the year as well as Triclopyr. And really the big difference between 2,4-D and Triclopyr is generally Triclopyr is safe on grasses. Although when grasses do get a little bit stressed, if it's been a little bit of a drought, Triclopyr can burn those grasses. So if you are a little concerned about that, 2,4-D would be my choice. But on the other side, the benefit of Triclopyr is much better on woody trees and brush. It works fantastic on bittersweet. Whether you do a foliar treatment, you can also do cut stump and basal bark treatments with Triclopyr. Second to glyphosate, Triclopyr is probably the most common product for cut stump and basal bark treatments. But yeah, if you have any sorts of brush, vines, woody species that need to be controlled, Triclopyr is always a great go-to there. And it's good too to keep in mind and look at your labels with Triclopyr. There's both a 3-pound and a 4-pound product. 3 pounds are the only ones that are aquatically approved, And that is because they are amines, where the 4 pounds are an ester, and none of those 4-pound esters are aquatic approved. So look at the label, make sure you are using an aquatic approved trichopyr when working in these environments. And if you are unfamiliar with amines and esters, the big difference is amines are slower to work. Esters are a little faster to work, but downside of that fast action, if you go to too high a rate, they do have some burning, some capacity to burn the plant. And you kind of burn the plant like a contact herbicide rather than a systemic herbicide. And there's big risks for volatilization. When you can't use esters on hot days, they really say below 80 degrees, you do not want to use an ester because it will volatilize, move off site, and cause some unwanted damage there. So luckily with aquatics, we're a little bit safer there, that we only have the amine to choose from. But again, make sure when you are purchasing and using products that you, again, are using an aquatic approved trichopyr. We'll move on to, so these next couple products, they have some gray labeling for using in and around aquatics. MSM 60, this is in the same herbicide group as imazapyr and imazamox. Although imazapyr and imazamox are broad spectrum herbicides, MSM is has some selectivity. It's safe on grasses, safe on most grasses, and only controls broadleaf weeds. MSM is rarely used as a standalone product. It's usually mixed in. Folks typically mix it in either with glyphosate or trichopyr when they feel like they need to broaden up their spectrum and a little better control there. MSM seems to kind of maybe give those products a little bit of legs, for lack of a better term. Multiflora rose, really anything with a thorn on it for whatever reason is highly susceptible to MSM. So if you're dealing with barberry, multiflora rose, things like that around your ponds, either glyphosate and MSM or trichopyr and MSM is a really good combination to get good long-term control of those invasive plants. But again, this product is not labeled in the Northeast for aquatic use, although it is permissible to apply this in marshes, swamps, and bogs after water has receded, as well as seasonally dry floodplains where surface water is not present. So again, you cannot apply this to surface area. Be very, very careful if using it near surface water to assure it does not get in there, but you can use this in seasonally dry wetland areas. So some other folks too, that they have stormwater retention basins that may have gone by the wayside, have not been managed, and they are dry, and there's a lot of woody plants. And thorny plants like multiflora rose, MSM 60 could be a good choice there. But again, do not apply this to water bodies. You're not allowed to directly apply it to water here in the Northeast. And another one similar to MSM, where it has very, very similar labeling, is aminopyrrolid. And much like MSM, aminopyrrolid does have labeling for control in weeds in dry stormwater retention areas, seasonally dry floodplains, delta, marshes, prairies, potholes, or vernal pools that have become dry. There's no standing water in there. So again, you can use this, you can't use it directly to water, but you can use it around water areas or in dry water areas and be successful. Whetstone or aminopyrrolid, it's in the same herbicide group as 2,4-D and trichopyr. So this is one that's best used early in the year for the best results. Can be applied foliarly, but it can also be applied in cut stump and basal bark treatments. The big difference between 2,4-D and trichopyr and aminopyrrolid is aminopyrrolid does have soil residual, so you have to be very, very careful when applying it. But if you are in some areas that have been wildly overran by invasives, you do need a little bit of soil residual to control those large monostands or monocultures of invasives. Aminopyrrolid could be a good option. Legumes in particular, like your locust trees, are very, very susceptible to it, as well as softwood trees. So keep that in mind. Great product if you are targeting those plants, but be very, very careful when you do not want to damage those plants as well. So that is that. So just always remember, read the label. It's always good to understand the herbicide, how the herbicide behaves, what these herbicides work on, and some of the risks associated with them. If you're ever unsure or nervous about using an herbicide, especially a imazapyr product like aminopyrrolid, consult manufacturers or agencies like myself. We're here to kind of support you guys, and we'd rather you see you all using these herbicides effectively and safely, rather than getting the phone call about damage that may have been caused. Always, of course, consult the label for your PPE. Make sure that you are wearing your PPE. Beware of the water use restrictions. Even if you aren't directly applying water, but you are on a vegetated buffer or around water, it is still good to be aware of those water use restrictions. And be very, very careful with your applications to make sure that you are not overspraying, or some of your drift or runoff may go into the pond. It's best to communicate those water use restrictions ahead of time and prevent any issues there with irrigation or drinking. Always make sure you're calculating water volume accurately. Very, very important for accurately dosing the products and preventing fish kills. And again, although we're not talking about in-water applications, I always say, keep dissolved oxygen in mind, and never treat more than half of a water body at a time. So that is that. I guess at the end of this, Kathy will be taking some questions from you guys. But if you do have any other questions after the fact, here's my email and phone number. I'm very, very happy to for you to reach out to me, and happy to help you out in the future. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Luke. Very, very informative presentations. So we have currently only one question in the box. So we'll see what we can come up with. Let's see. Hold on a moment. Oops. I'm going to go back to this. Let's see. So we've got a question for Luke. Scroll through here a bit. So how were the RTE species located at Westbrook? Was that a survey specifically to find them? And if so, was that a required survey or just serendipitous?
Sure. Thanks, Katie, for asking the question. So it was kind of, I don't think it was necessarily something that was required, and it definitely wasn't serendipitous. I think after it had happened, there was a pretty large interest by a lot of local ecologists to just go out there and see what was going on. So some folks from New York Natural Heritage Program, New York State Parks, as well as CTUC, did some of that surveying effort and kind of found them that way. And there have been repeat surveys there just throughout time by park staff. I don't know if Heritage Program has been back there in a couple of years, but some other conservation folks with CTUC have gone out to survey there as well. So there have been some repeat surveys as well to kind of go out there and find them.
Okay, thanks. We have another question for you. So what are the long-term habitat goals for the meadow? Will it be maintained as a wet meadow or allowed to reforest? And will it be managed for the RTE species present?
Yes, yes, and yes. So
okay.
Long-term habitat goals is to kind of just let it go through its natural succession and turn back into that emergent wetland habitat that slowly progresses into the forest habitat on the side. So it will, as far as I know, be allowed to reforest on its own with potentially some restoration efforts occurred in there to kind of, help along the recruitment of any native trees like red maples, different oaks, maybe some pitch pines as well. That's also, hopefully manage for those RTEs and prevent the frag from becoming a monoculture wetland, which we're all, most likely very familiar with at a number of the sites that we work on. So it's just kind of a unique point that we're at in terms of how that habitat is progressing. But CTUC is very invested in it, as well as New York State Parks, just because their office is actually just up in the Connecticut State Park, so it's quite literally in their backyard. So again, just to stress, we have a unique group of project partners that all have varying levels of investment in the site.
Okay, well, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So when you first started this project, was there talk about replacing the dam, or was that never on the table for Westbrook?
It was on the table for quite some time. So I should have actually mentioned that in the presentation. It's a very good question. It took, I would say, about 4 years until that final decision to let it remain a brook was actually made and confirmed.
Okay. And when they hired you as a consultant, did they have an end game in terms of what they wanted to see the property look like, or it was more let's see what we find and we'll adapt as we go?
I would say a little bit of both. So it was a little bit of adaptive management in the regard of, we want to just essentially stop the Phragmites from spreading further and give some of the other plants a chance to establish rather than the frag coming in and taking over. I think eventually, CTUC and parks would like to see a site management plan be completed for the area so that there's some defined goals and steps to kind of restoring it and how to move things forward. Just again, with how unique of a situation it is to have that kind of document, the guiding document in place.
Since no one else is asking questions, I'll ask you some more. So when they had this plan or this approach toward this property, did they have any sense of what was growing there prior to the dam? Were there any records or data they could draw upon? It was all just a discovery as you went along?
It's a good question. I don't believe so because I had originally first heard that the dam was about 60 years old, but in New York, the DEC's dam inventory, it has it dated back to 1902. So I don't know if there are any historical records, and I have not reviewed them personally myself. I still think either way, whether it was 60 years or 100 years, for things to just kind of pop back up from the seed bank and then also have natural recruitment from whatever surrounding area is pretty incredible to see. Some of the species that have come back are pretty rare, not just on Long Island, but in the Northeast at large too. So it's definitely been interesting to kind of see that occur.
Okay, cool. And then we have a question for both speakers. For shoreline management, are there certain species that you have seen that are more successful on reservoirs? And this person is saying he knows this may be a little bit of a stretch, but he's curious if either speakers have any experience with that.
So
I'm sorry, what do you mean by that, Michael? Are there like certain species that are, I guess, been more successful in managing on reservoirs? You're talking about like certain products that are safe to use on reservoirs that we've had success?
that, or are you talking about species to plant on shorelines to kind of help, stabilize things like that? Introducing species for vegetation, Okay, so Paul, I could take first crack at this if you want to maybe add to it
Yeah, go for it,
afterwards.
Luke.
I don't know where you're located, Michael, but you'd obviously want to try to use anything that is native in areas like that. Cattails, which are native but can get pretty rampant in certain areas, are really good at taking up nitrogen. So specifically in a reservoir system, that could be something that you want to include. But similar to Phragmites, they could grow pretty aggressively in sites. So you want to be careful about also potentially introducing them. But again, they're really good nitrogen fixers. Depending on the site, it's really tough to say, but pickerelweed is another plant that you could use in that kind of area of that, shoreline going into the water. It's a very attractive looking plant, good for pollinators, has a really nice flower, and is certainly something that would do well, and it doesn't grow that tall either. Swamp loosestrife or Decadon verticulatus is another option that you could include. It's kind of like a nice, what is the term for it? It kind of like grows in a nice like little curve, and it gets pretty long, and it just really helps stabilize the shoreline. In that regard, if you would like, I believe my email information is provided here. You could certainly email me, and I could send a list of common emergent plants that we use in restoration efforts, similar to what you might be talking about.
Yeah, I think you said that well, Luke. Thanks.
Okay. A question for Paul from me. Not seeing any more in the chat box at the moment. So as a sort of weekend gardener who is working on invasives removal, are there any over-the-counter products that folks could, the standard gardener could use if they're not certified, that you could recommend in place of glyphosate?
Yeah, absolutely. Triclopyr is one that you could buy right over the counter from a Home Depot. That would be a great one. It's, there's not soil activity there, so there's not a lot of offsite risk when typically using a triclopyr product. So that's a really good go-to. Again, it's safe on a lot of your grasses, and it works on a wide range of stuff. You could also buy a Mazamox over the counter as well. I know Home Depot and Tractor Supply sell those products as well. So where triclopyr does not work on grasses, if you do have some troublesome grasses, a Mazamox would be another good product to buy.
Okay, thank you. Looking for more questions. Anyone else have any more questions for Paul and Luke? If not, I'm going to throw in another one for Paul. So do you see any variation in terms of using one particular herbicide for maybe cut stump treatment or the basal bark treatment? Are there particular species that you know of that do not respond as well to? Is there a variation in response among the species that you've used for treatment?
Yes, absolutely. So for the most part, it seems like glyphosate and triclopyr on cut stump, their efficacy is about the same. Really, it's
Okay.
dealer's choice. Really, the one differences is glyphosate for cut stump, you have to mix it with water, where trichopirs, you have to mix it with an oil. So if you are doing a winter application, oftentimes if folks are using water-based products, they will freeze and they're difficult to apply. So folks that do applications in the winter typically prefer a trichopir because there's a lower freezing point with the oil-based mixture. So that's the real difference there. I just know a troublesome one for folks has been the tree of heaven. Those ones seem to be very, very persistent and continue to sprout even after herbicide applications, as well as autumn olive does that sometimes as well. But folks that deal with those will likely use an imazapyr or the aminopyrrolid cut stumps. They seem to have a little bit better long-term control compared to a glyphosate or a trichopir. But off the top of my head, the autumn olive and the tree of heaven are two of the really difficult ones to control. That's why we have to use a stronger active ingredient.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any more questions for our speakers? Give a minute or two for folks to type something into the chat. Not seeing much here. Maybe a minute or so, and then if not, we'll have an early weekend. So that should work out well. All right. Well, thank you both. It's been really great having you in the webinar series, and the talks have been very informative. So I really appreciate your taking the time to compose these talks and give them. And I do want to just share my screen to remind people of the upcoming events. Let me do that. Can get that to work. Whoopsie. There we go. All right. There. Sorry, folks. Okay. So stay tuned for our next winter webinar series, session 2 on Thursday, February 26th, which is the focus on Aetokthonos hydrillicola, which is the epiphytic cyanobacteria, which is associated with hydrilla, known to produce toxins and statins that impact waterfowl as well as raptors and produce vacuolar myelinopathy. So stay tuned for that research. And again, a recording of this webinar will be posted on www.neapms.org. And I also want to keep folks apprised that it's almost plant camp registration season. So please keep a lookout for those announcements, and to wish you all a happy Friday the 13th. So thank you again, Luke and Paul, as well as the staff at the BCEE, our communication folks, Craig and Stephanie, for assisting with this webinar. So I wish you all a wonderful holiday weekend and enjoy your Friday the 13th.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.